If you like the video, then please consider supporting Slopes Game Room on Patreon. There was a time during my early gaming life that I remember bloody well, and that was when I became a big boy. No longer was I interested in games such as Castle of Illusion, Rainbow Island, Sonic 2 or Fast Food Dizzy. Well, actually that's a lie, I still played those games. But what I'm getting at is that now I started to gain interest in the games that I once thought were for big boys. I suppose it all started with the classic Streets of Rage game. Sure, I was a little intimidated by it at first, constantly wanting to play tripe like this instead. But soon, not only did I get to grips with it, but more importantly, I became obsessed with it. Which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But it didn't stop there. Game after game that was intended for those big boys constantly found their way into my collection alongside the fun and classic cutesy platformers, and in time I would like to give them all the complete history spotlight. However, today we are going to finally take a look at a long requested game series that I have some serious personal nostalgia towards. This game came out of nowhere for me. I literally didn't know what I was getting myself into. I remember seeing a screenshot of your character running towards a bike, and as I had so much fun with this game, I decided to take the gamble. And boy, was I happy I did. So, join me as we take a look into the Road Rash franchise, where we'll be shifting our sights onto the rather obscure beginnings, the struggling development the company it helped build, and of course, the games. Welcome to Slopes Game Room. God, would you look at that? How far has this humble little 16-bit series come? Well, actually this isn't all that good. In fact, it's actually bloody awful. What would have been nice is if Criterion Games, you know, the guys behind the Burnout franchise, actually got the license and made a Burnout vs Road Rash crossover. Haha, well, at one point it was something that almost went ahead. But due to interest and funding internally, it never happened. And if you watched my complete history of Burnout, you will know that there was never another Burnout game released. Oh, come on, what are the odds? Anyway, crappy spiritual successors like Road Rage and games that never made it aside, yeah, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. Ooh, look at that logo. But that's winding you up. One of the most hated game companies, sorry, scrub that, hated companies, period, that have ever existed. Is that fair? So-so. Sure, they release what is technically DLC every year for the wallies that constantly buy it and send it back to CEX 6 months later. And on the flip side, they release technically unfinished and unplayable games that almost force you to buy DLC if you ever want to get any sort of fun out of them. But for me, I don't really care. It's all white noise because although I don't agree with these practices, it's everything else that the company does that really does get me excited. EA has published some insanely good games. In fact, some of the very best the world has ever seen. Guaranteed every single person watching this video, even the casual gamers, have been branded with that EA logo cattle prod several times in their life. And for that, I am thankful for Electronic Arts, a shoddy company from time to time that perhaps looks at the money chart a tad too much, but one that truly doesn't deserve quite as much hate as they get. But hey, that's what comes with being probably the biggest video game publisher ever. And, did you know, this was always the plan. You see, that nasty video game crash of 1983 that we like to talk about so much killed off quite a few console-only developers, and to play it safe, you really needed to be resting in the home computer arena of game development. Sure, there isn't as much to make in this arena, but at least you're safe from finding your expensively created cartridge being sold in a Toys R Us bargain bin for a couple of quid. Now, there are instances that the company tested the water with the odd cartridge on the newly crazily popular Nintendo Entertainment System, but the majority of workers were scared of jumping into the console market deep end. And because of this, EA released some incredibly safe releases based around popular sport endorsements. In fact, that's something they still do to this very day. And next on the list was Mario Andretti Racing for Nintendo's little breeze block saviour. However, Randy Breen, the guy who was tasked with the project, was bored. He had just worked on the latest Madden and Indianapolis 5000 games on the Amiga and DOS systems, and this new game, well, it wasn't really doing it for him. You see, your job as the driver in this game was to drive the same single track for 500 miles in real time. Because of this, the team started brainstorming new ideas, and this was when Dan Geisler, the eventual lead programmer of Road Rash, remembers driving his motorbike, no doubt at top speed, along Mulholland Drive to Los Angeles to see some friends. He remembers thinking to himself, man, if you wiped out here, you would get some serious road rash. And the newly crafted motorbike game with the working title, Road Rash on Mulholland Drive, was pitched to take this game's place. Sorry, Mario. Now, obviously, the game got shortened after showing it to the higher-ups at EA, and it was agreed that the simulation-style game would be dropped for something far more arcade-like. Plus, shifting development from the NES to this new shiny black 16-bit system that was actually boosting arcade-like gameplay as one of its selling features seemed to be the perfect fit for the new game. And with that, Road Rash had officially started development.
But only if you own Genesis from Sega. We bring the arcade experience home.
This junky mess is Vet, believed by many to be the first ever open-world driving game, and it is what Dan had worked on at Spectrum Holobyte before moving to EA. The game, although incredibly hard to look at nowadays, was actually quite groundbreaking at the time, and more importantly for this video, it helped lay the groundwork for what Road Rash would eventually become. The more the game progressed, the more the developers had to argue with the EA suits. You see, those top dogs wanted to be more realistic, and the devs wanted it to be an arcadey mess. Thankfully, after several rather heated meetings, the devs got their way most of the time. This wasn't your daddy's bike game. This was something new for a more radical generation of gamers that wanted something fresh and rebellious. It's not too far off to think that this was Grand Theft Auto levels of "oh no you didn't" for the early 90s player. Which makes this next fact even more ridiculous. With this being way before the days of simple Google image searches, lead artist Arthur Cooch actually had to go and convince a police officer to have pictures taken of him on a motorbike for his artistic reference to use in the game. Anyway, it's safe to say that the game was shaping up to be something quite special, but it was when they added the ability to attack other bikers that things really started to shape up. This was easily the biggest hurdle for the development team to overcome. I'm sure it comes to no surprise that this company is heavily sales and marketing driven, and having a game mostly created by sim driving developers that would include both driving and fighting would result as something incredibly hard to define into a genre. You see, nothing like this had ever happened before. Sure, heavy inspiration came from such legendary titles as Hang On, and yes, that complete history is on its way, but this was something completely different. A game that Dan created to make people forget about this legendary title. Looking at it nowadays, of course it didn't accomplish that, but by early 90s standards, it most definitely did. When Road Rash finally hit the shelves, surprisingly in Europe first, in September of 1991, followed closely by the North American and Japanese releases in November of the same year, it quickly went on to become EA's most profitable game that they had ever released to date. So, shall we look at what all the fuss is about? This is the original Road Rash. If this was the only Road Rash game, it would be incredible. However, as most of us already know, the sequels did sort of kick its ass. But we will get to those shortly. Even with the game's limitations, when I picked it up for the first time in forever, I couldn't put it down. Its jumpiness, its crazy motorbike floatiness, and its drastic drop in frame rates all do not take away from this game's core selling feature: its gameplay. There's something truly spectacular with this game, and all of those negatives I just listed out actually help make the game what it is. A product of its time, however, a product of its time that has fully stood the test of time. There's nothing like quite breaking the virtual law and beating the crap out of anyone that tries to pass you, all whilst trying to keep a close eye on oncoming vehicles and sharp turns that will catch you out more often than not. I remember as a kid finding the whole thing quite daunting. It scared me off a little, but with so few games to play and getting some rather weird enjoyment out of the game's stunning wipeouts before manually having to run back to your bike, I pushed on, and as a result, I became a better gamer for it. This original game will always stick with me. It's far from the best, but that doesn't make it a bad game. It is well worth trying out. And with the overwhelming success that was Road Rash before Christmas that very year, let's not forget it came out in November in the majority of the world, EA did what EA do best and quickly greenlit the sequel. And even though that first game took a whole year and a half to create, this one had only 1 year available to try and top it. Thankfully, however, the groundwork was already done, and the team was able to basically refine what they had already done for the sequel. And although the game obviously looks and feels nicer with more animations and plenty more to play with, the biggest addition added to this one was of course the addition of a split-screen multiplayer mode. This proved to be extremely difficult for the team, whereas the animation guys wanted to make the game look even better, including not only cutscenes but like I said, more frames of animation and plenty more to see on the roads. Now they needed to find a way of showing all that extra stuff twice. But somehow, after almost a quarter of its time spent in developing this feature, they sussed it out. Everything was refined and everything was working its way towards a rather exceptional game that completely outshadows its original. Road Rash 2 even gave players the opportunity to fight the cops, who in this game were given the privilege to fight back. This was yet again something that the EA bosses had to be persuaded on. But before you all huff out a typical EA, this time there's a fairly good reason for it. You see, EA wasn't exactly big on blood and gore in the first place, and considering the whole Rodney King beatings had just hit the headlines showcasing American police officers as the bad guys for the first time in the vast majority of Americans' eyes, doing the same thing in this game turned out to be quite a risky move. But they obviously did it anyway, and Road Rash 2 was released worldwide in November of 1993. As I already stated, the original nailed it, and all this game is at first glance a nice polished version of the original, which is essentially what it is. Coming out at the exact right time, it most definitely is the most remembered version in the whole trilogy. And with that classic chain whipping, how could it not be? Yet again, there's something truly special here. Even though these games are arguably the originators of the genre, future combat racing games really should take a step back and play this one. Road Rash 2 is the perfect blend of action and racing. You never feel wound up by one of the two genres, and although you could argue that earlier racing games did it better, what you gotta understand is that the game's limitations actually work in this game's favour. You start off pretty slow, but as the game progresses you build up your bike stats, helping invest you into the Road Rash world more and more. And thankfully, due to the game's password system, you can come back anytime and pick up right where you left off. If you own a Mega Drive and plan to collect for it, then Road Rash 2 is an absolute must. Play it and you will quickly learn why it is so fondly remembered. As you may have guessed, straight after number 2, well, nothing actually happened. Well, straight away that is. Dan wasn't exactly happy, you see, with the compensation he received for those first 2 games, and he actually applied for a job at Crystal Dynamics, which he got. However, EA was desperate to have him stay. After all, he just helped create what is arguably the company's most popular franchise, outside of all the licensed title ones that is. So, they agreed to his upfront costs and he did exactly that. He stayed and got to work on Jordan vs. Bird. Dan wasn't happy, and in a drunken rage somehow convinced those top dogs at EA to get to work on Road Rash 3, which they thankfully accepted. This was originally going to be the final EA game released for the little black beast, and Dan was advised to do whatever he could to make it look the best he could. The first big change for Road Rash 3 was to take those American races worldwide. 10 locations were mocked up and a final 7 got chosen. New weapons were implemented, including the ability to keep hold of your weapons between races. However, the biggest change that makes this game stand out from the earlier games is its implementation with what was going on over on the 3DO port of the original game. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the 3DO version of that original game, and obviously it looks stunning compared to what was going on over here. And it was even better than what was going on over here on the Mega CD. Huh, there you go, an awesome 3DO game. You don't hear that every day. Yep, digitized characters was most definitely the way to go. And with systems like the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn already out, and with that 3DO version coming out later that same year, it seemed that this sort of thing was the future. Was it? No, of course it bloody wasn't, but thankfully it did help differentiate this game from the legendary Road Rash 2 on the franchise's home console. So, a stunt guy was called in to capture the main driver and random members of EA, primarily on the Road Rash team, dressed up as the passers-by. EA knew the game would be big, and it was. Released in 1995, Road Rash 3 actually sold better than Road Rash 1 and Road Rash 2, and it rounded out what is possibly one of the very best trilogies for the system. Is it the best? It's hard to say. Most people would prefer number 2, and I think I'm with them on that one. Although, you gotta love those new digitized sprites. The game itself doesn't actually play any better. Sure, there's more to see and therefore more to get in your way, but it's Road Rash. It's just the characters look like they were ripped right out of Pit Fighter, which is apparently a good thing. Now, with all that said, the reason why more people prefer number 2 is probably because this game came out very late in the Mega Drive's life, and therefore, even though more people purchased it, by this point, it was starting to look quite dated, and therefore, isn't exactly remembered as much. Overall, it's Road Rash, again, and that's not a bad thing. It feels slightly harder than the previous installment, which I welcome, and hey, what else is there to say? If you like these games, and let's face it, everybody does, then this is a brilliant final entry in the original trilogy. Welcome to 1998. As the world is getting ready for the new millennium and what sexy radiator looking beast would come, being rad and tubular, was starting to fade away. Thankfully though, the Road Rash franchise, although created during the height of the Cowabunga era, always stood out due to its slightly more mature appeal. And it was because of this that the franchise was able to come back quite easily and slot itself alongside the PlayStation's slightly darker atmosphere with a licensed soundtrack to boot. The results, well, they're not that great. So many games lost it when they went from 2D to 3D. But Road Rash? This should have been a no-brainer. I would have put my bottom dollar on this version being the best. Although plenty of PS1 games feel dated by today's standards, driving games have always been great at changing such a simple formula to be played in 3D. With awesome fighting mechanics, it just seemed like the perfect idea. But alas, it wasn't. Road Rash 3D feels like it's a game that was created by a team of people that hadn't even played the original trilogy. Sure, it's got bikes, but that's pretty much it. The gameplay feels like it's heavily fallen into the racing side, on the perfectly balanced racing and fighting seesaw. Sure, combat can still be found in the game, but it's few and far between. Nothing makes me ever want to go back and play this one, especially considering the multiplayer has been completely scrapped. Even the bloody cutscenes don't really capture the comedic value of the original slapstick ones. This was such a massive shame for the series that had done so well up to this point, and as it was EA's chance to showcase such a brilliant franchise to a whole heap of new individuals on a brand new system, it not only failed, but it gave the series a really bad name. And if you ask me, EA didn't help matters either, stating that the game's lack of multiplayer was due to the way that the game was being read from the disc, which basically means they couldn't get it to work, even if they wanted it to. Yeah, alright EA, you keep feeding us that mouldy crap. Because only a year later, when it was released for the N64, it was reworked and now has a far more heavy emphasis on combat, with the multiplayer thankfully being added in. This time, obviously, for 4 players. Now, I'm not a big fan of the N64, I've stated that many times on my channel, and I think that this game's washy looking graphics really do a good job of explaining what it is about the system that I don't like. For me, the game looks far worse than this game, but with that said, it's obviously the far superior game, as it includes all of the PlayStation's mishaps. All in all, the game actually isn't all that bad. It features some pretty intense fighting sections that are far more crowded than the originals, and it has a decent amount of tracks to choose from. You can upgrade your weapons and bike once again, although this time with far greater ease. And the soundtrack is actually quite enjoyable too. However, sadly by this point, the game doesn't really offer next to nothing that takes the series further. And although it may be fun to bust it out for an hour or two with friends over loads of Slopes Game Room branded beers, yes, that's a real thing, the game is completely forgettable. So, where does this leave us? Well, as we are all welcomed into that new millennium, we got to see our final game in the series for the PlayStation with Road Rash Jailbreak. This is sort of a mixed bag. Personally, in my opinion, the game seriously suffers from the let's make everything realistic and dark era of gaming. Let's just look at it compared to the 3DO version and the Mega Drive version, and you can see just how unappealing this game looks. Gameplay wise, however, it actually fixes a lot of the issues found in both Road Rash 3D and a few extra ones from Road Rash 64. It's far from perfect, but it's still fairly enjoyable. The multiplayer, in fact, is actually quite inventive and features a really good cops and robbers mode, and surprisingly a co-op mode which requires your new little helper here to turn with you into the corners to help steer your bike. It's actually quite ingenious, and a great example of limiting each player's controls, forcing you to work together. Put the time in with a buddy over a few slopewisers, and you got yourself a rather solid multiplayer experience. Upon release, the game got average scores at best, and I think that's probably quite accurate even by today's standards. There is fun to have here, just don't expect much from it after a day or two of playing. Worth picking up if you see it for cheap. Now, surprisingly, this game was also ported to the Game Boy Advance 3 years later, and it's actually not all that bad. Once again, comparing it to those classic games, it seems like the perfect follow-on. However, it's yet again average at best. It's a lot more forgiving, only really making you wipe out after quite a few hits rather than just the odd one. The driving itself tends to almost steer itself, only really requiring you to do the odd little bit at the end, but it does look surprisingly good, possibly even contending with the best in the series. But something is missing. It doesn't feel like Road Rash. It only really slightly plays like Road Rash, and therefore, well, it isn't really Road Rash, is it? By 2003, plenty of games had taken on this Road Rash racing and battling system, and in a lot of cases, they've done it better. So when this game came out, it was incredibly old news, and that Road Rash name, it just couldn't save it. Sadly, it's been tarnished enough up to this point, with some rather mediocre attempts at constantly trying to revive the series, bringing this once incredible franchise, sadly, to a close. So there you go. The Road Rash franchise, a series that pretty much nailed and perfected it during the 16-bit era with its ports. Sadly, they couldn't really find its footing no matter how hard it tried, falling over every hurdle in its way until it eventually just threw away the keys. Like I teased earlier, Criterion Software actually showed interest in creating a Burnout and Road Rash crossover. Sadly, however, this never happened. Perhaps it was because Dan wasn't behind it since that original trilogy. However, light did shine at the end of the Road Rash tunnel when a random user on Reddit posted the question asking why hasn't this game resurfaced? And Dan actually replied, saying that after being a bit burnt out after the original trilogy and taking a much needed 20 years off from the series, he was willing to make a spiritual successor called Hard Rider Back in the Saddle. Sadly, however, without proper investment and with no intention to take the project to Kickstarter, he eventually dropped this cool idea. So now where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us with only two unofficial, as in nothing to do with those original games. First up is Road Rage. This game is really not very good. Not only is the name incredibly bland, the gameplay is too. I suppose the idea sort of makes sense. Instead of one single track racing and battling, the game is now open world. Sort of how Burnout did it. Sadly though, this game, well, it feels incredibly unfinished. The whole thing is a pure mess of clunky controls, no real story, glitches every 5 minutes, and genuinely, it's just boring to play. Not worth picking up at all, and, in my opinion, is even worse than the not great later PlayStation titles. Which finally brings us to Road Redemption. In all honesty, a game that is actually a pretty decent attempt at not only capturing the original essence of the classic games, but also bringing it to a new generation. I can't deny it. Great fun is to be had here, and for only £15 you're going to struggle to find much to moan about. In short, there's really not much to say. This for me is the perfect follow-up to the originals, injecting just enough to make it slightly harder but keeping the core gameplay of fighting, whilst frantically trying to keep an eye on oncoming traffic and sharp turns, alive. Before playing this game, I was really worried. I was worried I was going to end this whole thing on a massive low point. But this unofficial budget game is the Road Rash unofficial saviour, leaving the vast majority of the franchise in the dust. Look, if you're new to this series and want to find out exactly why so many people love it so much, all you need to do is play these games and then this. Everything else is a repetitive mess that isn't worth your time or money. Can much else be done with the franchise? Probably not, and whilst other games try and replicate those classic series dating all the way back to its roots, even with EA pushing out skitching, and more recently doing the same thing in games like Grand Theft Auto 5, it all falls back to Road Rash. A game series well remembered for good reason. Hey there guys, thanks for checking out the video. If you've made it this far, be sure to give me a high five in the comment section, and hey, why not a thumbs up too? But this is the part of the video where I give a usual shout out to all of my Patreons, with a special shout out going to Andrew Dalton, Ben Hall, Blitz, Hedgie, Brent Craft, Brian Rawson, Casey Garner, Conrad Constantine, Creamy Elephant, Dunder Control, Gavin Gonna Get You, Yum Yum Yum, Gemma at Mr. T-Shirts, Ian A. Chapman, James Loveridge, Joe Lazares, Michael, Mike Fallon, Petty Mew, Phil Lowlins, Pretendo 64, Retro 10X Gen, Richard Carter, Fantastic Dizzy, Ryan Burford, Taylor Almond, Todd Paul Float G, and Zane Powers. If you want to be part of this list, get your name shouted out, get your name shown, come and see what I'm working on, share your stuff in the Discord chat, do plenty of other quality Patreon exclusive stuff, then please click the link that you see on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, a thumbs down, whatever you prefer. But for now, this is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.